Welcome to the session on fiscal policy, public investment and natural resources. The first speaker is Susan Young, and she's going to present a paper on government spending effects in low-income countries.
Thank you for coming to this session. The paper I'm going to present is Government Spending Effects in Low-Income Countries. And this paper is joined with Wenyi Shen and Felipe Zana. So government spending is an important counter-cyclical tool for countries of all income levels. In low-income countries, pressing capital needs also give government spending one more additional role for promoting economic growth. However, lack of sufficient and reliable data restricts the estimation of government effects in low-income countries, except two of the recent papers by Cray. He uses official lending data to estimate fiscal multipliers in low-income countries and developing countries. So in this paper, we are going to take a theoretical approach. So we will use the DSG model to quantify the government spending effects in low-income countries. So our starting point is a two-sector New Keynesian model. And we modify this model to account for important low-income country features. And these include a large share of poor and hand-to-mouth households, and also limited international capital mobility and public investment efficiency. This would mean that $1 of investment spending is going to give much less than $1 of installed capital. And then we will compute multipliers for government consumption and public investment separately, and then identify the important factors that will affect government spending effects in low-income countries. So let me just preview the main results. The first result is that limited capital mobility makes financing sources in terms of domestic and external funds matter a lot for spending effects. So external financing will increase the resource envelope available for the domestic economy, and this will reduce the crowding out effects commonly associated with government spending. And then, on the other hand, the capital inflows from external financing can appreciate the real exchange rate and then reduce the trade output. So the second finding is that although capital scarcity in low-income countries implies high return to public capital, the public investment efficiency will substantially affect the fiscal multipliers. And the last finding is that the degree of home bias in government purchases is important because public investment scaling up in low-income countries often rely to a large extent on imports of material, equipment, and skilled labor. So the short-run stimulative effects from the demand side are generally weak. So let me go through key features of the model. This model has two types of households. One is the forward-looking savers, and the other one is liquidity-constrained hand-to-mouth households. So in this model, to build a nominal model, we adopt the money in the utility function specification. And also the model, notice that in the government budget constraints, there's a distorting taxes, tau t. To introduce this tau t in order to capture the distorting effects of fiscal adjustments. And then the first line of the government budget constraint, AC, that's the adjustment cost for holding foreign liabilities or assets. So what this means is that by control the adjustment cost, we can control the degree of openness in the capital account of the private sector. And for the hand-to-mouth households, they consume all the disposable income each period. and they do not have access to financial and capital markets. So the model also has two sectors, traded and non-traded goods. So consumption and investments are both seen as aggregates of non-traded and traded goods. And also households supply labor to both sectors. However, the two types of labor, they are not perfect substitutes. So to introduce the nominal rigidity, we assume that the non-traded goods are produced by monopolistically competitive producers. And notice KG in the production function, that's public capital. So public capital enters the production function to raise the productivity of private inputs. And also to introduce the price rigidity, firms will face adjustment cost in the quadratic form following the Rothenberg specification. And for the traded goods sector, we assume that the traded goods sectors are perfectly competitive. This assumption is driven by the fact that most manufacturing in low-income countries focus on low technology or resource-based activity, production activity. So we assume that traded goods firms are perfectly competitive. And for government, each period, government collects taxes and issue domestic bonds and foreign bonds to pay for, and they also receive aid and seigniorage revenue to pay for government purchases, which consists of government consumption, GCT, and public investment, GIT. They also provide transfer to households and pay the service debt payment. Government purchases, GC and GIT, they are also seen as basket of traded and non-traded goods. And let's look at the last equation for public investments. So public investment in the model accumulates to public capital. Typically, the epsilon T in front of GIT, this is what we call the investment efficiency. And this number is typically a 1 for advanced economy. But here, we are going to assume epsilon takes a value much lower than 1 to capture the investment efficiency. And for fiscal policy, we assume that the government consumption and the public investment policies follows an AR1 process. And we let income tax rate, tau T, respond to debt to GDP ratio by gamma. So this gamma is positive. When debt to GDP ratio is above, last period is above the steady state level, then the tax rate, income tax rate, will increase to stabilize debt growth. And in this model, we are going to consider 3 financing methods. The first one is domestic debt, and the second one, external debt. And we also consider aid finance public spending increase. So to close the model, given the less developed money and the financial markets, many central banks in low-income countries are still targeting money in practice. So for simplicity, we assume that the central bank follows the money growth rule with nominal reserve money grows at a constant rate. So to solve the model, we first log linearize the equilibrium system and then use Sim's algorithm to solve linear rational expectation model. And the model is calibrated at a quarterly frequency. And it's calibrated to an average low-income country based on data of sub-Saharan African countries. And let me just highlight a few parameters. So the first one is the measure of savers. In typical DSG model, most households are forward-looking. However, in low-income countries, the survey data finds that only a quarter of households have access in a formal financial institution. So in this model, we calibrate that only 25% of households are savers. And for public investment efficiency, we set it to be 0.4. And this value is based on the empirical estimates of the literature. Roughly has investment efficiency at 0.4 or 0.5. And output elasticity for public capital, This number 0.11 will imply a rate of return for public capital at an annual rate of about 25%. So it's reasonably high for low-income country. Finally, for capital account openness, 1,000 implies that the cost for a just foreign liability holding is quite high. So basically, this number implies an almost closed capital account for the private sector. Okay, let's look at the result. The government, this is the impulse response for an increase in government consumption at the 1 percentage point of GDP. So we focus on the two financing methods, domestic and external debt. So if you look at the domestic debt, the black dashed lines, consumption and investment responses are quite negative. And this is common crowding out effect associated with the spending increase. However, if the financing method switch to external debt, you can see that the blue lines for consumption and investments are less negative or even turns positive for investment. However, you see that the real exchange rate will appreciate much more, and this leads to much higher decline in traded output for government consumption increase. And in the later periods, both consumption and investment responses are still negative, and this is due to the tax rates they have to increase to stabilize the debt. To compare the government consumption effects, we also compute the present value cumulative multipliers for GDP and its various components. So if you look at this table, the first two, the top panel is for domestic debt financing. And if you compare that with the middle panel, external debt financing, that's focused on the output YT. And you can see that the impact multiplier is much bigger associated with the external debt financing than with domestic financing. And this is because consumption multiplier is much higher and investment multiplier is much less negative. And if you, however, let's just also look at the traded goods output. As we show in the previous picture, the impact multiplier for the traded goods output is negative, and it's much more negative than with domestic financing. And the difference between the external debt financing and A financing is more in the long run. So if you look at the 5-year multiplier, with A financing, it's still quite positive, 0.15. However, with external financing, it becomes almost zero. And this is due to that with external debt financing, the tax rates have to be higher in the longer term to stabilize the debt. However, with A financing, tax rates do not have to rise. That explains the higher multiplier for A financing. Here I just want to make one point that the difference between external and domestic financing for government consumption actually vanishes when the economy becomes more, the capital account in the private sector is become more open. And this is due to that if you have an open capital account, private sector will actually counteract the borrowing by reducing their borrowing in the international financial market. And once they reduce their borrowing, this means that the total resource amount available for the domestic economy is going to be similar to with just domestic financing. That's why the financing method is only important when the government, when the economy has limited capital account mobility. One last result, to see the role of a government investment efficiency in the public investment multiplier, we do the exercise to raise the marginal efficiency. So the top panel is the result under the baseline efficiency 0.4, and the bottom one is under the marginal efficiency 0.8. And you can see that even though the rate of return for public capital is quite high in this economy, both at the annual rate of 25%. However, if you have higher marginal efficiency, the multiplier can be much higher, especially in the longer run. And in this particular calibration, the multiplier can go up, go beyond 1 at 1.1 for high efficiency. Okay, given time restriction, I won't repeat the conclusion, and this is my presentation. Okay.
Okay, I really enjoyed reading this paper. I think it's really a solid contribution in the literature on macroeconomic effects of fiscal policy in low-income countries, and I'm sure it will become a reference point very soon. There are three messages that I took home from this paper. One is that low-income countries should prioritize productive government investment as opposed to wasteful government consumption. The second one is that they should put a lot of effort in reducing investment inefficiencies. And the third point, that they should resort to external financing as opposed to domestic one, in order to widen rather than to shrink the resource envelope. There is just one point that I would like to make, and it is basically I suggest giving public investment an even better chance, in the sense that, for example, there are some more optimistic empirical estimates on the public investment multipliers. For example, there is a very recent paper by Eden and Cray that is based on 39 low-income countries, and they find a public investment multiplier on 1.5. So, since this is a theoretical paper, I would explore the channels through which even higher public investment multipliers may be achieved, not only to match possibly disputable empirical results, but especially to look at the normative side of things, and so to basically provide some policy implications and some suggestions of what are the channels that may yield even better outcomes. And for example, there is one channel that may be more explicitly explored, that is the one of the return on public capital, that can be linked to the phase of public investment that relates to the choice of projects. So, for example, here a very important result is that if you increase public investment efficiency, then the public investment multiplier can dramatically increase. But public investment efficiency, I think, relates more to a second phase of public investment, which is the one of the implementation of public investment projects. So I would look also at a prior phase, which is the phase in which public investment projects are selected. And so if the government selects those projects that have higher returns, then maybe the multiplication effect will be even higher. So right now, for example, the return on capital at the steady state is calibrated, if I'm not mistaken, at 25%. So there are also in the empirical literature, there is a wide range of possible returns. So I would also maybe add one more table with results for somewhat higher returns. So, any questions, please? Okay, I can give you this.
low-income countries in Africa are increasingly moving towards targeting inflation based on interest rate. Is that something that you could incorporate in the model, at least as to consider how things will react?
Okay. To address that question, then we have to replace that money rule by a more like a standard Taylor type of rule. Then we can consider the interactions between the monetary policy and the fiscal policy. And here we don't really focus on that, so it has a really simple rule, but that's doable in this framework.
Thanks for an interesting paper. I haven't had a chance to read the paper, but your presentation is very clear, and the comments by the discussants are also very clear. You mentioned public investment efficiency, and you mentioned the figure of 0.4 as your assumed for the low-income country. Is that based on the work done in the IMF by Giovanni and others on the public investment management efficiency index?
No.
Or how is it derived?
Okay, so there's two papers. So Richard has a paper in 2000, so he estimated the public investment efficiency for different countries, areas. But for sub-Saharan African economies, he obtains 0.5 if you assume there's no GDP growth. But if you assume there's some GDP growth, then it will be even lower. So and the other paper is by
We have to use the mic is maybe your
and the other paper is by Hurling and Aristo of 2010, and they estimated the investment efficiency for two countries, Colombia and Mexico, and for two countries roughly about 0.4. So I will safely pick some number around 0.4 and 0.5 for public investment efficiency in a low-income country.
Okay, so the second speaker is Samuel Wills, and he will present a paper on 8 principles for managing resource wealth.
Okay, hello? Can everybody hear me? Fantastic, okay. Excellent. Okay, so my name's Sam Wills. This is a little piece of work that's basically an extension of my MPhil thesis here at the University of Oxford. And what I do in this paper is think about how countries should be managing their natural resource wealth, thinking about whether or not they should be using it to spend, save, or invest. So to begin with, there's a bit of motivation. I think that this is a first-order policy question, and it's something that's in the papers, very, very frequently. So to begin with, we have Kenya's recent oil and major oil discoveries. We also have Ghana's discovery of oil in the Jubilee field back in 2007. We have increasing oil production in Libya, and again back to Kenya, as well as Uganda and Tanzania. And all of these countries are thinking about what they should be doing with either revived or increasing oil production, how they should be managing this resource wealth, whether or not they should be using it for domestic investment, consumption, or saving abroad in a sovereign wealth fund. Okay, so what I do in this paper is I basically ask, how should countries like Kenya manage their natural resource wealth? Should they spend it? For which there could be arguments in terms of consumption smoothing. Spending this wealth today may be beneficial because future generations will be wealthier, and so there's an argument for spending more of this resource wealth today. The second question could be in terms of, well, should it be saved? And there's also a strong argument to be made in this case as well. The idea here is that oil wealth is volatile, and so there's an incentive to save, build up a buffer stock of assets in the interests of precautionary savings. But there's also been some recent work saying that this resource wealth should be invested domestically because of capital scarcity, and so that the rates of return on this oil wealth are relatively higher at home than they are abroad, and so as a result, this oil wealth should be invested. And so what I'm going to do is basically bring together these things and answer this question for the first time, thinking about how capital scarcity interacts with oil price volatility. And so the way that I go about this is I'm going to use a few simple tools from continuous time finance. And by doing this, I'm going to be able to use essentially two equations. Okay, the model will be boiled down to two simple equations. And in these two equations, I'm going to be able to nest quite a lot of existing results. We're going to get out 8 different punchlines from these two equations, some of which are new, some of which are sort of covering work that's already been done. And this is going to include both developed and developing countries. Okay, so these are the 8 principles we're going to be able to get out. They cover both developed capital abundant countries, which I'm not going to be talking about today, but they also think about how developing capital scarce countries should be managing their resource wealth. And the punchlines we get out are things like we should be using it to finance consumption and investment. We should be using this oil wealth to finance both consumption and investment because both generations today are going to be poorer than generations tomorrow, and the rate of return on domestic investment is going to be relatively higher than foreign assets. We're also going to see that extraction matters in developing countries because in these countries they have less access to finance in order to sort of stabilise their resource revenues, and as a result, the choice of extraction is going to affect the decision to spend or save. Introducing absorption constraints, we're going to see that temporary parking fund can have an important role. We're going to see that the volatility funds that many countries are being set up in many countries. Some of it should be invested domestically if capital is scarce. The reason being you want to equate the rate of return at home and abroad. And finally, there's going to be an argument for supporting private investment. So how do we go about doing this? So we're going to be thinking about both developed and developing countries, and we're going to slowly increase the complexity of the model, adding in sort of bells and whistles in 3 stages, thinking first of all about a deterministic oil price, adding in stochasticity, and then adding in general equilibrium. And in doing so, we're able to generate new punchlines with these 2 equations. And what we see here is just how it fits into the existing literature. So the green ones are the punchlines that are new. The white ones are the sort of existing results that are being nested within these 2 equations. Okay, so how do we, let's just jump right in and have a look at what the model says. So the way we're going to set it up is just, it's a little bit of continuous time stochastic optimal control. We start off with the value function there. Foreign assets are here, which accumulate, so we have some sort of rate of return on foreign assets is going to be dependent on the stock of foreign assets. Okay, so if you have a stock of debt, then you're going to be incurring a higher interest cost, which is sort of the way in which we incorporate capital scarcity, which is a common way of doing it in the literature. Foreign assets accumulate, you're going to be receiving oil revenues, which is the price of oil times the quantity. You're going to be receiving output, which is a function of the capital stock, less what's being consumed and less what's being invested. And the source of stochasticity in the model is going to be this sort of Wiener process driving the oil price. Okay, so that's the basic setup of the model. To solve it, we just set up a Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman equation. We see that there's going to be a couple of conditions. Most importantly, there's going to be one linking the foreign assets to domestic capital. They're going to be tied together because what you want is to basically equate the rate of return on your domestic assets with those on your foreign assets. You can summarize all this using a single variable, which we're going to call total assets. And doing this, we're able to solve the model and generate 2 equations. So what are the 2 equations? We start off with a consumption oil equation, which is very standard. This is the standard R minus rho. This is the effect of an interest premium on your decision to consume today or tomorrow, and this is the effect of precautionary savings. The second equation is an asset accumulation equation, and again, this is the rate of return you earn on your existing assets, plus your oil income, less what's being consumed, and this is some sort of steady state level of consumption. Okay, so what I want you to take away from this is that we're going to be considering all of these 8 different principles just using these 2 simple equations. And then we're going to be playing around with the equations by changing the variables. Okay, so we'll start off by thinking about what happens when oil prices are deterministic. So sigma is going to be equal to 0, which turns off all the precautionary savings in the model. We're then going to, well, in the developed country case, think about what happens when the interest premium on foreign assets is going to be equal to 0. And so this term turns off. And then in developing countries, we're going to turn that back on again. And so we're just, by slowly playing around with these simple parameters, we're able to nest quite a lot of different cases. Okay, so let's jump in and think about what the punchlines are. So in terms of a little bit of motivation, what are we thinking about here? So a case that I think is quite interesting is the island state of Nauru in the Central Pacific. And it's, I find it particularly interesting because this is where I spent a number of years growing up as a child. Now, this country is a classic example of how countries may not want to be managing their natural resource wealth. You can see here that, so Nauru was a phosphate island, and essentially the entire core of the island was mined out for phosphate. Phosphate's a useful fertilizer. And as a bit of a comparison, this is an image of the Kalgoorlie super pit gold mine in Western Australia, and the two of these 2 holes are about the same size, which is, I think, a little bit interesting. Now, the way that Nauru used this resource wealth was not, for example, for rehabilitation of their environment, domestic investment and that sort of thing. Rather, they spent far too much of it on domestic consumption, the most classic example being a yellow Lamborghini for the police chief to drive around the single road on the island, which was a circle. Okay, so that's a little bit more motivation. So what should capital scarce countries be doing with their natural resource revenues? Well, the first punchline is that they should be using it to finance consumption and investment if capital is scarce. And the reason being that essentially that the rate of return on domestic assets is going to be higher than on foreign assets. And so you're better off investing these resource revenues at home than abroad. And this is essentially nesting the work of Rick van der Ploeg and Tony Venables in their EJ paper in 2012. This result can clearly be illustrated using a phase diagram. And so I'm going to show you this phase diagram, and I'm going to show you how it's extended when you start thinking about oil price volatility. So what we have here is dynamics of total assets and consumption, which are the 2 equations that we have. This is the steady state line for total assets, and this is the steady state line for consumption. This is the stable saddle path. And basically we assume that a developing country starts off with a low level of total assets, below its steady state level, and it's going to be accumulating assets and having growing consumption over time, so it's going to be moving in this direction. Once it passes this steady state level, then you turn off your risk premium and you can just basically accumulate as much assets as you like. So what happens? Country starts out here, it discovers oil, and it jumps up and raises consumption immediately because they're going to be relatively wealthier. Now, during the anticipation period, between discovering oil and beginning sort of receiving the revenues, then consumption and total assets will slowly be growing. At this point, the accumulation of total assets is accelerated because they're using these resource revenues, and at the end of the windfall, they end up back on that saddle path, slowly accumulating consumption and assets towards that steady state level. So I've shown you this because I'm going to be showing you how volatility affects it in a couple of seconds. Does the extraction path matter? Okay, so the punchline here is basically that in developing countries, the path of oil extraction is going to matter for your fiscal policy. And the reason is that you can't smooth out these oil revenues as simply because there's limited access to foreign assets. So all else being equal, a short intensity, sort of a high intensity windfall is going to be preferred to a longer, low intensity one. The reason being you have a higher net present value. But that being said, you can get some sort of interesting and slightly counterintuitive results with the effects on consumption. Essentially, in some cases, you should be saving less from a high intensity windfall than from a low intensity one, and the reason being the effect on future generations. Given we've got limited time, I'll keep moving on. So what about absorption constraints? So this again is nesting some existing work that thinks about whether how investment should be managed if there are some absorption constraints in the economy. so that there's a cost to sort of flooding investment into the country. And basically the punchline is using a temporary parking fund to hold some resource revenues abroad while investment capacity is being built up. Okay, next punchline. What happens if oil prices are volatile? So this could go in either direction. If oil prices are volatile, there could be an argument for saving more resource wealth abroad. The reason being that you want precautionary savings, right? You want to build up a sort of a volatility fund to smooth out your resource revenues. And this should also reduce borrowing costs. So there's a double whammy for saving some of this resource wealth abroad if it's going to be volatile. But we also know that in developing countries, there's going to be higher returns on domestic investment. So how do we balance these two things? And this was, I guess, the original intention of the paper, to be able to balance these two competing motives. And this is what we see. So what we see is that when a country is capital scarce, they're going to want to direct some of their precautionary savings to domestic investment. Why is that? So the idea is that in capital scarce countries, first of all, they're going to want to accumulate a smaller volatility fund than in capital abundant ones. The reason being that capital scarce countries should be saving a lot in any case to build up a stock of assets and overcome this capital scarcity. And as a result, the extra savings that come from precautionary savings has a very high cost because of the convex utility. As well as this, capital scarce countries should direct some of their precautionary savings towards domestic investment. And the reason for this is basically comes down to the role of the volatility fund. So when a developing country builds up a buffer stock of assets against resource revenues, you really should be thinking of it in terms of a stock of assets that's an extra source of income rather than a fund to be dipped in and out of relatively frequently. And the reason is that oil prices are very, very persistent, and so any shock to the oil price is going to sort of be relatively permanent. So that means that we should be splitting this volatility fund between domestic investment and investing in foreign assets. And we can see this in the phase sort of a reinterpretation of the phase diagram from before. So the blue case was the one that we saw previously. The red case is what happens when you add in oil price volatility. So this is an extension of Rick Vanderpool and Tony Venables' paper. What happens is, rather than this being your target level of assets, your target level of assets is going to move out here. And over time, the target level of assets that you want to be aiming for is going to be changing because your exposure to oil price volatility changes. So as you pull oil out of the ground, that oil is your sort of total oil wealth is going to be less exposed to oil price volatility, and as a result, your need for precautionary savings is going to change. And so over time, this line is going to shift in towards a deterministic case. As a result, your sort of stable saddle path is also going to shift in, and the resulting dynamics are basically drawn by this line here. So initially you start consuming less, sort of to build up this buffer stock of assets, but eventually you end up at the end of the windfall consuming more. And so volatility is this precautionary savings is a form of commitment device to sort of accumulating more assets. And this is just an illustration of how oil price volatility exposure changes throughout an oil windfall. So it rises during the anticipation phase and then declines as oil is extracted out of the ground. Okay, the final punchline is around supporting private investment. So here the idea is, well, what happens if private investment is also constrained? It's not just public investment where there are bottlenecks. The punchline is, well, the first step should be developing a domestic market in private capital so that you're able to equate the rate of returns on capital in different sectors. The second is then, if the government has preferential borrowing rates compared to the private sector, there could be a case for using the government to capitalise the domestic banking sector, something like the funding for lending scheme in the UK. And then finally, if the private sector has better access to capital than the public sector, then there's a case for investing more in public capital because of the co-investment that comes from private capital. And the result of all this is that the real exchange rate in these developing countries should be slowly appreciating, basically as a byproduct of the Rybczynski theorem. As you accumulate capital, you become more specialised in traded goods. Labour moves from the non-traded to the traded sector. The country generates more income. However, because there is less output in the non-traded sector, there's going to be higher prices of the non-traded sector, and that's a real appreciation. Okay, so the punchline is, we moved through it very quickly, but this paper is essentially, the intention is to use these two equations to nest quite a lot of existing results on whether countries should spend, save or invest their natural resource wealth. It covers both developed and developing countries. We've only talked about the developing countries today. And it thinks about both when oil prices are deterministic and also incorporates a bit of stochasticity as well. Okay, so that's it. Thank you very much for your time. I'll hand it over to the discussant.
Okay, I would like to thank the presenter for the wonderful presentation. I picked mainly 2 points from the presentation. The study highlights the importance of differentiating policy options for developed as opposed to developing countries. This is particularly important because of the difference in structures of the economies. What applies to developed countries, which are normally capital intensive, cannot be applied in developing countries. Therefore, it is important to come up with suggestions and policy options that are specific to developing countries, which they can apply in their countries. The second point is that it doesn't only make a difference between developed and developed countries, but it also offers quite a number of options for developing countries, because even the developing countries are not on the same levels. So there is need for countries to save their resource revenue depending on what exactly is specific to their situation. So I can say I think this study adds to the literature in that way. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
More questions?
So I guess, it's kind of too late, but, so I guess the question is it possible to break up countries into the stability of the administrations and see if the optimal responses are the same, depending on what kind of political scenario they have?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Yeah, thank you very much. I think, so what I've tried to do with this paper, as you've seen, is keep it really parsimonious. 2 equations, keep it simple, possibly useful for teaching and just for nesting existing results. But I think your point makes a lot of sense, and I think it could actually fit into this by playing around with the way in which we model discount rates. And I think using those discount rates, we might be able to tell a bit more of a political economy story as well. So that's an excellent suggestion. I'm going to sit down and have a think about it. So thank you very much. Yep. Oh, should we start here first?
Thank you. One thing missing in the 8 points is the weak economic governance structures, especially in sub-Saharan African countries. Now, with the discovery of oil, so for example, these already weak governance structures become even weaker. And that might change sometimes the scenario of whether to save consumption and invest in the future. Say, for example, the question we need to ask is whether the governments with these windfall revenues put some effort to put the structures in place first, especially in terms of macroeconomic conditions, right? Including the fiscal scenario. So, for example, if you look at the Norwegian example, they didn't straight go for a sovereign wealth fund, but first, with the revenue, they started addressing the macroeconomic problems, especially immediately starting paying off external debt, say, for example. Thank you.
So I think that's an excellent point as well. I think it is something that I would really like to have in the paper, more around this governance. Thinking about how I'll do it sort of parsimoniously is something I'm going to have to sit down and think a little bit more about, but I think it's an excellent point and very well taken, so thank you very much. Yep.
Could you put up the slides with your 8 principles one more time?
Yep.
So you say that the extraction path matters if capital is scarce. I'm trying to understand what does that imply for a policy maker. And typically for most countries, the rate of extraction is determined by usually a private corporation that's got a contract with the government. And they make their determination on what's the rate of extraction they would optimally wish to do based on market prices. So is that really a policy variable for a government? When that, and it goes back to your question about volatility. So if there's price volatility and it changes the rate of extraction by the company that has a contract to extract, exactly how should a government play this game?
So what this paper suggests is that, so if you just give the choice of extraction to a private company, then they're going to sort of do it by sort of minimising the present value of extraction costs, and they'll come up with so that they'll be focused on that. What this paper suggests is that for a developing country, when you receive the resource revenues matters for development, and as a result, there's going to be some sort of externality that the private company is not internalising, and so that's going to change the way that the government would desire resource revenues to be extracted. And so that suggests that in the negotiation process, they may want to sort of alter the rate of extraction or have some influence over the rate of extraction over and above just the way that the private company would want that to happen. Whether or not it's faster or less fast depends on the mix of the parameters, but that no doubt will change from country to country.
But your model at this point doesn't have this sort of feedback loop term between price volatility, effects on the rate of extraction, and therefore the decision rules of the government.
Yeah, so the price volatility is not in the extraction in this part. I do have another paper which thinks about how oil price volatility should affect the rate of extraction when countries also have a sovereign wealth fund. And so that's so in a separate piece of work I've sort of covered that, but I'd be more than happy to pass that on if that'd be of interest. Yep.
Thanks, Sam. One of the big differences between developing and developing countries is the degree of separability between fiscal and monetary policy and the dominance of one over the other. I think in this model, the government is treated as a kind of single entity. I wonder if you could say something about how that might give some nuance to the model if you could treat those two as separate things.
Yep. So this is a real model. We don't have any role for monetary policy in this. It's just a question of fiscal policy. So I've looked at sort of fiscal and monetary interaction in other papers as well, but this one, I don't think there's any scope for getting monetary policy in there because the intention is to keep it pretty parsimonious. But as you say, it's a very important question. So thanks. Okay. Any other questions? Great. Well, thank you very much for. Yep.
For number 7, does the model attempt to determine the an optimal range of percentage terms that should be invested as opposed to saved for principle number 7?
Yep.
And any attempt to determine in time duration of that investment?
Yep. So So volatility does affect both the aggregate amount of savings in capital scarce countries as well as how much should be invested at home versus abroad. And we find that volatility should reduce the amount that is, so capital scarce countries should respond to volatility relatively less than capital abundant countries. So Ghana should have a relatively smaller volatility fund than Chile and Norway. And the reason is that they should be saving quite a lot in their future generations funds anyway, because of their sort of, first order domestic investment needs. The second point is that they should be investing some of it domestically in sort of domestic public capital. And the reason for this is that the volatility fund isn't necessarily just a fund for dipping in and out of, in response to sort of every oil price shock. It also has a role as essentially compensating future generations for the oil price risk that they have to bear. And so what you want is it to generate a rate of return that can be used as a supplementary source of income. That supplementary source of income should essentially be generated both at home and abroad, because you want to be investing in domestic assets and foreign assets so that their marginal products are equal. So that's the sort of the punchline we're getting at there. Okay, any other questions? Great, well, thank you very much for your comments. They're very, very well taken. Should be very helpful. So thank you very much. I'll get to my one of these and I'll swap.
Okay, so the next speaker is Vandudzai Mbanda, and she will present a paper on the growth and employment impacts of public economic infrastructure investment in South Africa, a dynamic CGE analysis.
I greet you all. Sorry.
These were the slides that I prepared as a discussion. Is this... Which ones are your slides? Sorry? Okay. Do you have it on a USB stick?
Maybe do.
Because these were the slides that I prepared as a discussion.
Is it on now? Okay, it appears my slides are not here, so I have to get them from my laptop. Okay, I think there was mixed up with the slides. I'll present our study on the impacts of public infrastructure investment in South Africa using a dynamic CGE analysis, particularly focusing on growth and employment impacts. First, I'll just give an outline of the presentation. I'll start with the introduction and background to the South African economy, as well as the background to the infrastructure investment initiative, brief literature methodology, the data which is used to calibrate the model. Then I'll move to the simulations and results. South Africa is an upper middle income country, and from the 1990s up to now, its annual GDP growth is similar to that of the other upper middle income countries. It is a large economy which contributes 25% of Africa's GDP, and it is classified by the World Bank as the 28th largest economy in the world. In general, there has been positive economic growth in South Africa from around the 1990s, which averages 3.3%. South Africa is faced with what has been coined as the triple challenges of unemployment, poverty, and income inequality. The growth, which is moderate, which it experiences, has been unable to solve these three problems. Despite the three challenges, it also faces other challenges like problems with infrastructure. There is the infrastructure investment in the country is poorly located, it is inadequate, and it is also faced with a skills shortage, which also impacts on unemployment. The level of unemployment has been persistent, and from the 1990s, it has been over 20% every year up to now. The jobless growth which is experienced in the country is attributed to lack of infrastructure, both in terms of investment in infrastructure as well as maintenance of existing infrastructure. The problems are also attributed in part to underinvestment, which has been experienced from around the 1960s. The data in the country shows that from around 1986, public infrastructure investment as a percentage of GDP has been below 8%. Because of this background, the government strongly believes that infrastructure investment is the key to addressing these challenges that the country is facing. And this is reflected in the macroeconomic policies that the government has been putting in place. There were three main macroeconomic policies in 2006, 2010, and 2011, which all point to the importance of infrastructure in addressing the challenges in the country. Particularly the 2011 macroeconomic policy, which is the latest in the country, identifies infrastructure as the #1 key job driver for the country. So job creation will be important, that it reduces poverty and it also reduces the gap between the rich and poor, that's addressing inequality. The government scaled up the investment in public infrastructure from the period leading up to the 2010 World Cup, partly in preparation for the World Cup, as well as taking advantage of that infrastructure environment. And from around from the 2009-2010 fiscal year, the country has invested in public infrastructure of an amount of about 1 trillion rand, which is approximately $92 million. Despite the relatively good core national infrastructure in the country, there are some areas which particularly have quite poor infrastructure services. This is true especially for the rural areas as well as the areas even in town, but where the majority of blacks have been moved to during the apartheid period. This is indicated by the low access to infrastructure services. As an example, South Africa has very low levels of access to electricity when compared to its peers. For example, in 2010, the access to electricity, according to the World Bank, was 75.8%, whereas among its peers, for Brazil, it was 98.7%, for China, it was 99.7%, and for the upper middle income group of countries in which South Africa belongs, it was 97.4%. This indicates that there is still room for South Africa to improve its infrastructure services for it to be on the levels of its peers. This inadequacy in infrastructure not only hinders economic growth, but it increases the cost of services, particularly to the poor and the unemployed. In this regard, the government aims to further improve the infrastructure investment, which currently stands at 7% of GDP. So the aim of government is to increase public infrastructure investment to 10% of GDP by 2030, as well as to improve the gross fixed capital formation for the country to 30% of GDP. The literature that is available on the impacts of public infrastructure investment indicates that there are direct and indirect impacts of investing. This is because marginal productivity of factors of production increases when there is infrastructure investment. This also lowers cost of production, thus triggering an increase in employment and growth. However, the literature also shows that the impact of public infrastructure can in effect be negative. This is when there is crowding out of private investment by public investment. Thus, the impacts are not always clear, and it is important to quantify this impact for South Africa, because as we saw from the previous presentation, what works in country A might not necessarily work in country B. So even if there are positive impacts from other countries, it is important to have an impact start for South Africa. Why? Because South Africa is faced by a skills shortage. It is faced by an inflexible labor market, and these labor market conditions can actually result in not so positive results of infrastructure investment. The study uses a dynamic CGE model, which is the Poverty and Economic Partnership Research Network model. This is a generic model that can be adapted for use by any country. The model assumes imperfect substitution of capital in a constant elasticity of substitution function. Sectoral output follows Leontief production function, that is value-added and intermediate inputs are mixed in fixed shares. Value-added is a CES combination of capital and labor. Investment in the model is savings-driven, and savings are exogenous. Investment is the total of private plus public investment. Public investment is assumed exogenous, that is, it is determined first, then private investment is what is left after the level of public investment has been set. And this is actually what is in the reality, because the level of public investment is set through the budget. Therefore, the government determines what it wants to invest, and then what remains of the total goes to the private sector. The model is calibrated by a 2005 social accounting matrix for South Africa. Some people might argue, why 2005 when we are already in 2014? But this model is a real model, so it basically uses the structure of the economy. So there haven't been any major changes in the economic structure of South Africa since 2005, and therefore the 2005 data is still okay. The social account matrix has 53 commodities and 53 activities, 2 production factors, that is capital and labor. Because, as I said, this is a generic model, we adapted the model to suit what is the reality on the South African economy. As I said again previously, South Africa is faced with high levels of unemployment. Therefore, we incorporated unemployment in order to reflect this by using the wage curve. We also incorporated externalities by adding spillover effects of the infrastructure investment. So we have the business as usual scenario, which makes assumptions on the variables in order to simulate a regular growth path for the economy. And then we have 3 simulations. In all simulations, capital investments of the public economic sector is increased, and the basis of the increment is based on the actual data that is available in the country. Thus, the model mimics the actual policy in South Africa. The reason why we focused on the economic sectors only is because most of the government is devoted to the economic sectors. About 80% of the public infrastructure investment for the current 3-year medium-term period, which is from 2012 to 2014, 80% of that budget goes to economic services, which are energy, transport, as well as water services. The difference in the scenarios that we simulate are in terms of how they are financed. In the first simulation, we finance the infrastructure investment by adjusting the government budget deficit. In the second, we finance through taxation. There is an adjustment in the tax rate on firm income. And in the third scenario, we combine the 2 first financing options, that is government deficit plus the adjustment in the tax rate on firm income. The results show that increasing public infrastructure investment in South Africa indeed have positive impacts on the economy. This is because we observe an increase in GDP, demand for labor increases, which triggers a decline in unemployment, the price level falls, private investment rises in general, but however it is negatively affected in the period of the shock, and this indicates some crowding out of private investment. This graph shows the change in GDP, percentage change in GDP from the business as usual scenario. So, as I indicated in the previous slide, there is a positive impact on GDP in all 3 scenarios. The increase in new capital investment for public economic sectors triggers an increase in both capital and demand. And because we assumed a Leontief production function in the model, therefore demand for intermediates also increases. Thus, the increase in public economic infrastructure impacts the economy via intermediate demand, especially through indirect linkages. In general, there is positive impact on sectoral production. However, we observe a decline in capital demand for about 10 sectors, which is due to the crowding out effect. Otherwise, there is generally a positive impact on capital demand in all other sectors. As infrastructure investment increases, demand for intermediates and labor increases in government economic sectors. And in order for government to attract labor from other sectors, the wage rate increases also, so that the government economic sectors can be able to attract labor from the other sectors. Thus, while some sectors experience an increase in demand for labor, particularly the government sectors, as well as those sectors that have direct linkages and indirect linkages with these sectors, the other sectors observe a decline in demand for labor. However, there is an increase in aggregate demand for labor for the whole economy. As labor demand increases in public sectors, it also increases in service sectors as well as primary sectors, which are mining, agriculture. This has an impact of reducing unemployment across the economy. And because we modeled a wage curve, the wage rate is expected to move in the opposite direction. However, this is not always the case, because there is substitution of formal labor with informal labor, which is formal labor is the only labor which is employed by the government sectors. So this is probably the reason for these results. just to talk about other results, other variables, there is an increase in household consumption. Firms are affected negatively by this simulations which have taxation, that is simulation 1 and 2, particularly in the short run. However, the firm's conditions recover in the long run as investment increases, as production cost, and as there is an increase in productivity. This table shows the decline in the rate of unemployment. It indicates that the third simulation actually has relatively better results than the first two simulations. So this study shows that public infrastructure investments has a positive impact on growth and employment in South Africa. However, it is important to look at the financing option. The results indicate that financing public infrastructure investment through government budget deficit is not sustainable in the long run. The combination of deficit financing and the tax rates is actually better both in the long run and in the short run. We acknowledge that our study is limited by only looking at two financing options, and we plan to extend this to include other financing options. Thank you.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yep. So first of all, thank you very much, and I think particularly given the technical hiccup which you handled excellently, so I think it was a very interesting presentation and very well done. Thank you very much. To start off with a bit of an overview, this paper, the purpose of this paper is to quantify the effect of an increase in public infrastructure investment in South Africa. And I think as a result, it's an important piece of work, and it's very useful sort of doing these quantification exercises because they give an idea about exactly how big the effects that we're talking about are. The way that the paper does this is it uses a dynamic computable general equilibrium model. It has perfect competition. There's no forward-looking behaviour that I can see. There are some implicit financial frictions in the domestic in the accumulation of domestic capital. There's a spillover of infrastructure onto technology, and then there's a wage curve that's being used to generate this unemployment, a relationship between wages and unemployment. And the effects of this model is it finds that infrastructure investment increases GDP, reduces the price level, and reduces unemployment, all of which are expected. But I guess the purpose of this is more to give an idea about the degree to which each of these variables changes. So the comments I'm going to make are sort of in 4 different areas. First of all, I'll just put these out there and feel free to take them or leave them as you like. The first comment I had is, at the highest level, why do we focus on public infrastructure investment? Basically, the South African government has said that it wants to invest in infrastructure, but I guess the first order of question is this the best way to spend public money? Would it be better to be sort of supporting private investment by tax breaks or capitalising the banking sector or cutting red tape? Why is public investment the best way to be spending this public money? Could it alternatively be spent on human capital accumulation with education and research or other forms of tax cuts? Why public infrastructure investment? And then if we take public infrastructure investment as what the government should be doing, I think something that would be really very interesting would be to figure out what type of public infrastructure investment is going to have the biggest impact. Is it roads, is it electricity, is it sewage? And a cool way to present it could be something like the stuff that McKinsey does with their cost curve analysis, where they basically rank different sort of policy options and think about what the relative effects on GDP are going to be. So you can see where the major gains are. So I think that'd be a really cool way to take this if you have the time. Around the model, so there are a few modelling decisions which well, I guess it'd be worth talking a little bit more about or doing some robustness around. The first is around this sector-specific capital. So the paper was a little bit confusing. It says that capital is both sector specific, but there's also only one type of capital. So I found that a little bit confusing. Also, you say that the rate of return on capital is not equalised across sectors, which basically suggests that there's no market for domestic capital in South Africa. And so it would be worth sort of talking more explicitly about why you've made that modelling assumption and what happens if you relax it, because presumably there is some sort of mechanism that is sort of allocating capital between different sectors. In terms of the accumulation of capital, the model isn't a forward-looking one, and so there's no sort of there's no scope for sort of forward-looking investment decisions. So it'd be, again, good to talk explicitly around the type of financial friction that you're sort of assuming is going on here. And moreover, there's also no endogenous savings decision, which it seems like an important sort of, it would play an important role in your modelling. So it'd be good talking about that as well. And finally, given that we're talking about investment in a sort of an emerging economy, it's good also to talk about the sort of potential absorption constraints or bottlenecks in domestic investment. And it may even be worth putting in something like sort of the Public Investment Management Index and figuring out how much, how effective this public investment is going to be. Thirdly, I wasn't really clear whether or not there are sort of traded and non-traded sectors in this model, how trade exposed to each of these different sectors, because I think that may change some of the results, which I'll talk about in a second. And furthermore, the way that unemployment was done is through this ad hoc wage curve, which is, I guess, a neat way to do it, but it would also possibly be nice to have some micro foundations around what's generating this unemployment, maybe some search and matching frictions or something. The third is around the results. So one of your results is that the public sector investment causes the price index to fall. If there is a mix of traded and non-traded goods, this may change depending on the consumption basket, I think. And this comes back to that sort of Rybczynski theorem effect. The idea that increasing capital increases the output of capital-intensive traded sectors, reducing the output of the non-traded sectors. And sort of the increase in sort of wealth will drive up the sort of demand for non-traded goods, which will drive up their price, and so the weight of non-traded goods in the public in the consumption bundle will sort of determine the effects on CPI, I think. But that's something to think about. And finally, the paper was good and it very clearly explained the model sort of qualitatively, but it'd be nice to have a sort of a quantitative formal exposition in the appendix somewhere. But yeah, other than that, it was a very interesting piece of work, so thank you very much.
Could you kindly tell us again why you decided to choose 2005? Is it because you don't have if there is actually some recent data, because a lot has happened in South Africa, and you look at some short run, you look at both the short run effects and then the long run, and then you consider 2005, and then we had there was a small recession in 2008, and I'm not convinced about the 2005, but if it's a problem of the data, if you don't have data up till maybe 2010 or 2011, then I guess it's okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for the question. As I tried to explain, maybe it didn't come out clearly, but a CGE model is a real model, so it's based on the real figures. So actually, if the structure of the economy has not changed, if you put the figures, whether they are for 2010 data or for 2005, if you put them to real figures, they will still be the same. Yeah. The other reason is South Africa has problems with reliable data. So at least the 2005 social accounting matrix has been tested and has been agreed that it is reliable. So I could use later data, but then most of the years the data has not been tested and agreed, like there's no consensus that the data is reliable. So it's both ways, one reliability as well as the 2005 still gives us the same structure of the economy as now. Yeah.
Thanks for a very interesting paper on an important set of policy problems for South Africa. You seem to focus on the effects on employment, on the CPI, and on a third variable, was it growth? But did you also do any work on the implications of public investments for inequality in South Africa?
Can you come again, the last part? Can you come again, the last part of your question?
Did your model, the CGE model, did you also try to draw conclusions about the effects of public investment on inequality in South Africa?
Not yet, because that's actually the other part of my work, because it needs a micro-simulation to do a detailed impact of inequality. Yeah. So I will feed these results into a micro-simulation in order to see the poverty and inequality impacts.
And a follow-up question. So public investment in South Africa, is it largely a question of parts of the population having unequal access to public investment assets? And therefore it's really about the geographical distribution of public investment? Is that the major policy decision?
The major policy decision for now is not on the it's not spatial. It's on the overall for the whole country. Of course, the spatial affects because where the poor are mostly is where there is poor services. But for now, the government's focus is on overall, because if you look, the investment drive that was taken prior to the 2010 FIFA World Cup, it was actually in the urban areas where there is, at the moment, more infrastructure. So it's just overall infrastructure. But I think the next step would be as well to look at the special distribution.
Okay, so last paper is going to be on natural gas public investment and debt sustainability in Mozambique. And this is a joint work with Yi Xiong from the International Monetary Fund. So first, a brief outline of the presentation. Basically, I will provide some key facts on natural resources and public investment in Mozambique. Then I will present some key features of the so-called Digner model, which is a general equilibrium model that we use to provide some simulations. And then I will talk about some ideas for future research. So the first key fact is that Mozambique has great potential in natural resources. They recently started a significant extraction of coal, and starting from 2020 onwards, they have a potential to become a major international exporter of liquefied natural gas, LNG, and some projections actually find that LNG as a percent of LNG export as percent of non-LNG GDP are likely to be significantly high, up to 32%. And at the same time, public investment in Mozambique has remained quite high in the post-Civil War period, around 13 to 15% of GDP, and this is partly due of the destruction of infrastructure during the war, partly due to the preparation of natural resource sector extraction, because coal and LNG needs roads, railways and ports to be extracted and commercialized, and because the country has huge development needs. And recently there was relatively easier access to financing, both through the traditional donors, the so-called Group of 19, and new active donors that are present in the country, in particular China, India, Brazil, Japan and Korea. But public investment scaling ups have also implications on debt sustainability in Mozambique. Actually, the projections from the IMF are on an increasing pattern for public debt to GDP, and from 2012 to 2013, the debt distress rating went from low to moderate, and this is partly due to the increase in projected volatility in the balance of payments. So what we do is we analyze these issues through the lenses of a quantitative general equilibrium model, which we call DIGNAR. And DIGNAR stands for Debt, Investment, Growth and Natural Resources, which is a model that I developed with Felipe Zanna and Susan Young. And this model merges two pieces of research that has been done at the IMF over the recent years. One is the so-called model-based debt sustainability framework, which is a general equilibrium framework to analyze debt sustainability in the context of low-income countries. So it has features that are relevant for low-income countries, just like limited asset market participation, public investment in efficiencies, and risk premium, and the possibility to resort both to concessional and commercial borrowing. Then there is another piece of research, the so-called sustainable investment tool, which it doesn't focus on debt sustainability, but focuses on resource revenue management policies, and hence introduces a stabilization fund or a sovereign wealth fund, and also absorptive capacity constraints and the issues of maintenance of public capital captured through time-varying depreciation rates. So DIGNAR has all these features, and it has also some additional features, such as a slightly different specification for the stabilization fund that has now a lower bound, which becomes a policy choice. And so whenever the stabilization fund reaches the zero lower bound or another positive lower bound that the policymaker chooses, then fiscal policy kicks in, and so there are some fiscal instruments that react in order to make debt sustainable. However, we also have some fiscal constraints that can be activated, such as caps to tax rates or floors to government spending on transfers, and this is useful to analyze the possibility of actually debt unsustainability. So why is DIGNAR suitable for the Mozambican case? Well, both because of the features that are low-income countries features that are particularly relevant for the Mozambican case, but also because the model allows anticipating the resource sector boom. And the idea is that the economy can resort to debt, possibly non-concessional debt, in order to scale up investment before the resource windfall comes in. And so the economy can use the future resource windfall as collateral in order to scale up debt in advance. And so what we do is we analyze these issues and through this model. I will not present the whole model, but just some key equations of the model. So as in Susan's paper earlier on, the mechanism through which public investment affects the productivity of private inputs is through the production function. So Kg represents public capital, and it augments the production function of the non-traded and the traded sector. Then there is a low motion of public capital, which is equation 2, and G tilde in equation 2 is a variable that captures effective investment, and so which is the portion of investment expenditures that actually is translated into the stock of public capital, and this is used to capture inefficiencies of investment in low-income countries. And in addition to that, effective investment will also depend on the degree of the scaling up path, so the degree of front loading, because as soon as public investment deviates too much from a certain threshold that can be imposed into the model, then absorptive capacity constraints will bind, and the degree of inefficiency will increase, and so a lower and lower fraction of public capital will be translated into of public investment will be translated into productive public capital. And in addition, we specify the scaling up path as a second order delay function, where we have 3 policy parameters that the government can choose, and one is GNSS, which is the new level of public investment at the new steady state, and then K1 and K2 represents the K1 represents the speed at which the new level of public investment is reached, while K2 represents the degree of overshooting, and so the degree of front loading of public investment. So we analyzed 2 scenarios for Mozambique. One is the baseline scenario, which is consistent with the projection of the application of another model, which is the FARI model developed by the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF. And according to, in the baseline scenario, the natural resource revenue, the government natural resource revenue has a potential to reach 40% of total revenue in Mozambique at the peak of the resource windfall. But then we also look at an adverse scenario where both the production of LNG is lower and exhaustibility issue come in, and there are also some negative price shocks that will decrease government revenue as well.
So, with the prices here, so are they anticipated changes, or is this just a simulation that you cast?
This is just a simulation. So we pick some we pick 2 paths, 2 possible paths. One is with let's say normal shocks, so shocks that are typically observed in the natural gas market, and the other has some more adverse shocks.
But at time zero, you anticipate all that future, that you anticipate all these.
Yeah, agents, yeah, this is a perfect foresight model. So basically, this is basically used in order to show the benefit of using a delinked path for public investment rather than a spend-as-you-go path. Yeah. So which pace for public investment scaling up in Mozambique? So we look at 3 possible scaling up plans. One is a conservative path, which basically waits for the natural resource revenue. So natural gas is projected, natural gas production is projected to start in 2020, so up to 2020, no scaling up occurs. And then public investment increases gradually up to 50% at a level which is 50% higher than the initial steady state in real terms. According to a gradual scaling up approach, public investment is increased right now in anticipation of LNG production. However, not in a very aggressive way. And the third possible case is the case of an aggressive approach where public investment is hugely front-loaded, up to 8% point of GDP. So the pace of the public investment scaling up affects non-LNG GDP, and this can be seen from this graph. We plotted some of the variables. So you can see the three in the upper left box. You can see the public investment in percent deviations from 2012 level. So the black line is the conservative path that awaits till 2020. Then the blue line is the gradual approach. Well, the red line is the aggressive approach where public investment is scaled up much more, and it's front-loaded. Well, basically the difference. Time, years, yeah, so it's from 2012 to 2030 in this particular years. Okay, so basically the difference between a conservative and gradual approach is pretty significant, and so a conservative approach would miss significant growth opportunity for the country. A gradual approach is anticipates some of the growth benefits early on. An aggressive approach through the channel of absorptive capacity constraints, and so a drop in public investment efficiency because of the fact that public investment is scaled up too quickly, then it will not have a massively greater effect compared to a gradual scaling up path. But this has also implications for debt sustainability, and especially if we look at two possible scenarios for the resource market, in the baseline scenario and the adverse scenario. Well, in the baseline scenario, no matter which path of gradual investment scaling up we use, this is always fiscally sustainable in the sense that total public debt will increase initially, but then as soon as the LNG revenue comes in, then total public debt will decline. In the adverse scenario, then because the resource revenue ends more quickly, then what happens is that with an aggressive scaling up approach, public debt is no longer sustainable, or it would be sustainable only with a very painful increase in taxes. Another issue that we look at is the issue of public investment efficiency and the return on public capital. And so basically by doing this exercise, we're looking at possible structural reforms that the country could make, both in the case of in the phase of project selection through an increase, for example, of the average return on public capital, and also with an improvement in the efficiency of public investment. So we can see that there are significant additional growth possibilities if both types of structural policies are performed in terms of additional non-LNG GDP growth. We may have an additional increase of almost 0.5 percentage points. Okay, so to conclude, Mozambique would miss significant growth opportunities if it employed a too conservative approach to public investment scaling up. And however, an aggressive approach is not desirable either, both because a lot of resources would be wasted due to absorptive capacity constraints, and for threats characterized by public debt sustainability issues. And these are more visible in the case of an adverse LNG price or production shocks. So a gradual scaling up approach that anticipates some but not all LNG revenue would be appropriate. And two key issues are good governance and careful project selection that have the potential to enhance the impact of the public investment scaling up. So the model can be used also for actually to pursue future research projects. Actually, right now I'm working together with Professor Paul Levine and Harun Ondorf from the World Bank to augment the model with human capital, which is a function of public investment in health and education. And this can be informative because it can give an indication not only on the sides of the scaling up, but also on the composition and what can be not necessarily an optimal, but at least a desirable composition, and given the degree of inefficiencies and the rate of return in the various expenditure items. And also with Felipe and Susan, we are planning to look at optimal policies using the model, or a version of the model, where we look at optimal degree of investment scaling ups and the degree of front loading, and this will be a function of the various features of a particular low-income country economy.
Hello? Is this on? Hello? Okay, thank you for the opportunity to discuss this paper. Okay. So this paper develops or uses a DSG model to assess debt sustainability for public investment scaling up in the resource-rich developing countries. And this investment scaling up is jointly financed by resource revenues and borrowing. Then the paper applies the model to Mozambique. The country is expected to be a major natural gas producer in Africa. And the resource wealth presents an opportunity to close the infrastructure gap, as well as to facilitate economic development. One key message is that the simulation exercise showed that an aggressive scaling up could advance the growth benefits of higher public capital. However, if the resource revenue or resource wealth do not realize as expected, then debt sustainability will be at risk. The framework used in this paper, as far as I know, is the first framework used to both jointly consider debt sustainability and the macro benefits of a higher public investment in a resource-rich country. And the model is a useful tool for policymakers to decide on the investment path when facing very uncertain and volatile resource revenue flows. And also the general equilibrium framework allows for capturing the growth investment linkage and the interactions among fiscal policies and private sector's decisions on consumption, investment, and production. And the model includes important lake-specific features, for example, the investment efficiency and the absorptive capacities. And these will allow to highlight the common concerns about scaling up investment in developing countries. Even though investing resource revenue in capital scarce economies seems to be an appropriate, desirable idea, however, the history has not been supportive for the positive outcome about investing resource revenue. So I think this is a good country application. I only have a few minor suggestions. One is that the model analyzes two scenarios. If a few more scenarios that will capture more extreme situations on both resource production and prices, and this may help to capture the possible range of the macro and the fiscal outcomes about investing in public capital in Mozambique. And also, I noticed that under the aggressive investment path, the implied magnitudes for fiscal adjustments in consumption tax is quite large. In later years, it will go up to 25%. So this magnitude may not be feasible, and since the model has a ceiling, so that you can impose a ceiling in the fiscal adjustment in tax rates. So if such a ceiling can be imposed, then the results, the debt will go up more quickly, and this will better highlight the risk associated with aggressive scaling up. And finally, regarding public investment efficiency, the baseline assumption, the efficiency is at about 0.6, and this is slightly higher than the literature value. So if the sensitivity analysis can also perform simulations on the lower efficiency, and this will further raise the risk for aggressive scaling up.
Okay, thank you. These points are all well taken. We can definitely look at more extreme situations, and as I told earlier on, the tax rate is massive in the adverse scenario, so that basically implies that debt is unsustainable, and so if we impose the cap, I'm sure that debt will explode. And then yes, we can do some sensitivity that we know already the direction of this sensitivity analysis that would make the impact on growth, of non-resource growth, lower, and also will pose some more threats to that sustainability itself through the non-LNG GDP. So, but this is something that we will do. Thank you. Are there more questions?
Yeah, thanks for a really interesting presentation. The simulations that you presented here, as far as I can gather, are about scaling up public infrastructure, essentially. You mentioned at the beginning that the model could also deal with uses of fiscal funds in other ways, so tax exemptions. Is that correct? There are other ways for the government to spend the money, essentially. So my question...
Yeah. There are other ways. Yeah, for sure. I mean, here we look at public investment, but actually the model could be used to look at other expenditure items or transfers or actually I think that right now my former colleagues at the IMF are using the model with transfers and other options. And yes,
the reason I ask is that the three scenarios you had for public investment, under the kind of extreme scenario, public capital was being scaled up very quickly at the beginning, and given the absorptive capacity constraints, that was obviously going to be a huge problem.
Yeah.
Now, if you could transfer the money to, if you could allow private investments to take up some of the slack, that would give you much better results, I would imagine. So
In fact, it's what we are doing in the extension that looks also at health and education, looks at the desirable composition, and this effect is also there, in the sense that if you spread across different items, then you decrease the risk of bumping into absorptive capacity constraints.
Yeah,
yes.
Thank you.
So, if I understood correctly the way it works, the model, the government is assumed to finance the increase in public investment by issuing debt. But I'm wondering whether there is another option to securitize future revenues and sell the rights of the exploitation of the
sorry, can you repeat the last bit of the question? I didn't.
So basically, I'm wondering whether instead of issuing debt, you can securitize future revenues by selling the rights of exploitation of
I think that somehow we are capturing this effect, because lenders would lend resources to the government because they know that the resource revenue will.
Yeah, but if you securitize, you transfer the risk to the buyer of the claim. So you don't issue that. So just, I'm going to...
I get your point, but I'm not sure whether this can be accommodated within the model. I think that the quantitative effect would not be very different, though.
Thank you. In one of your slides, you showed that in all scenarios, the public savings remain flat, except in the conservative scenario. Is it due to assumptions in the model, even when the revenue is generated, there's no positive impact on the public savings? At the same time,
are you referring to these slides here?
Yeah, the top right-hand side.
Yeah.
And then at the very end, you mentioned about the policy scenario where you focused more on the need for good governance structures. Is it arising because of this, or how it links?
So you mean about this?
Separate, not really. There was this graph, say for example, the two curves are basically flat. It doesn't have any impact at all, even in the long run, on the
because
savings.
in the adverse scenario here, what happens is that the revenue is not enough compared to the scale of public investment, and so they draw down the stabilization fund until they reach the zero lower bound limit, and because of that, then they have to resort to public debt once again.
So it is because of the assumption you make that it remains
Yeah,
flat.
it's because of the, this is endogenous in the model, but it comes from the assumption on the scenario for the natural gas sector. So basically in the baseline scenario, we have a certain revenue that comes in, and that is something that we impose through choosing quantity and prices. And in the adverse scenario, we on purpose we choose some prices and quantities that make the revenue less. And so in this particular case, then we have that government savings that the government cannot actually save.
So thank you very much. Really interesting presentation. Two quick questions. The first is coming back to Tom's question around the private sector and its access to capital. Can you just talk a little bit more about how private investment is working in this?
How private investment?
Yeah.
Well, private investment comes from the decision of private firms. So private firms have a production function and then they maximize profits. So.
And what's their access to sort of capital like? Like, is there a well-functioning domestic banking sector? Do they have access to international capital? You know, how are there any financial frictions at all in the private sector has?
Well, households have access to financial markets. Well, there are two types of households. There are rule of thumb households who do not have access to financial markets at all, and then there are optimizing households who have access both to domestic and external financial markets, but there are portfolio adjustment costs, so there is this kind of friction, and so firms basically they take resources from households in order to get capital, and so they rent capital and then they. Well, actually, they own capital, but they need resources in order to invest. Okay. And yeah, that's how it works.
And so, in that framework, is there some role for the government to then sort of capitalise the domestic banking sector, or sort of somehow support private investment?
We don't have banking in the model at all.
But somehow relaxing some of those frictions that you were talking about. I'm just saying that, like, so is public investment the only way?
The only friction that is for investment is investment adjustment costs, but there is not an additional friction in addition to that.
The other question I had was around volatility. So you mentioned that there's perfect foresight in the model, so that you cast forward a series of prices for the next sort of 15 years, but you know exactly what those prices are going to be today. So how exactly does this sort of debt sustainability work then? Like, you know exactly how much your revenue is going to be in the future. There are no sort of random shocks, and so when does it actually become unsustainable? So I thought initially that it was, you borrow a certain amount today, but your revenue is uncertain, and then at some point in the future you'll have a realised negative shock, and as a result you no longer have a sustainable level of debt.
Yeah,
it sounds like you don't have that mechanism. It's just a purely forward-looking thing.
No, yeah, exactly. This model is solved with perfect foresight for the time being, but actually, I mean, there is another project that is going on that is basically making this kind of simulation stochastic. The reason why we need perfect foresight right now is because the model has a lot of non-linearities. So, in order to solve the model and produce the simulations, it's just a technical issue of why we need perfect foresight. Right now, I think Felipe is working on a tool to make stochastic simulations using non-linear models, and this will take care, I think, of the price volatility which is not anticipated by agents.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for your good presentation, but I have a question about your model. What role play the financial friction in your model?
Financial frictions?
Yeah.
There are no direct financial frictions, if not, I mean, there is one financial friction, which is portfolio adjustment costs for households, but we don't have banking frictions or anything like that.
Okay, but how the firm receive funds from the household if there's no financial sector in your models? How does the firm, the entrepreneur, receive funds from the household if there's not financial sector in the model?
Well, you can assume that banks are there and they are just a veil that takes funds from households, and then they don't make any profit, and then they give funds to firms, but that would have the same the same effect. I mean, basically here the model assumes that firms borrow directly from households.
Without financial sector.
Yes, without financial sector. But this is kind of standard in DSGE models. But you can augment a DSGE model with a financial sector.
But practically in Mozambique, this is not the case. Firm cannot directly borrow money from the household without financial intermediation. There should be a financial intermediation between a household and firm.
As I said, if there were no frictions in the financial sector, then the results would be exactly the same if we had banks that are just a veil. Although, I mean, the model is already large, but it can be enlarged even further by adding banking frictions. But that, you know, I think is another type of project.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any more questions? Comments? Okay, so thank you very much for coming to this session. And I think it's time for lunch.